We're glad to be here with friends and supporters today in North Greenbush, although I was joking with Supervisor Desso that he might rather we were somewhere else, except for the fact that this community and certainly Rensselaer County have gotten a front row seat on the high cost and the threat of years of underinvestment in infrastructure, given the events of recent weeks. And we've been traveling around the state really for the last 2 years talking about this. Last year we spoke about it in the context of the billions of dollars in one-time settlement funds that the state received, and the argument that those funds should be invested in infrastructure, which is the best, most common sense use of one-time revenues. This year's conversation is a little bit different. We've been talking about the restoration of parity between the New York State DOT capital plan and the MTA, the New York City Metropolitan Transportation Authority capital plan. For years, you had parity, which I think is a fairly well understood term, equality. It's a word that's in the dictionary. It's not something that we made up. There's some that are trying to redefine it now, which is sort of creative, but I think everybody knows what parity means. And you had equal capital programs between the MTA and the DOT. And it's not just because people thought that them being equal was convenient or an easier way to keep track of the numbers, but it's because statewide taxpayers support the MTA capital plan through gas tax revenues that we all pay when we go and gas up at the pump. And that's a good thing, by the way, because the MTA, although some of us in these communities may not use it on a regular basis, if at all, is important to the state's economy because it's so critical to New York City and the broader metro region's economy. So it makes sense, but in return for that statewide support of the MTA, the deal was that the capital programs would be equal. And they were until 2009, 2010, when parity was broken with different political dynamics. The MTA was in crisis. Since that time, the MTA capital plan has outpaced the state DOT capital plan by more than $6 billion. And so why are we talking about this year? Well, the good news is that Governor Cuomo has shown a renewed commitment this year to infrastructure. It's a big part of his agenda. And he has pledged an additional $8.3 billion over the next 5 years to the MTA capital plan, fully funding their capital plan at $26.1 billion. The other good news is in his State of the State budget address, he pledged to achieve parity between DOT and MTA. The bad news is we've got a lot of work to do on the budget to get there. The capital plan that he's proposed for DOT is $20.1 billion. And you don't need to be a math major, and we don't need to go ask the comptroller whether $26.1 billion and $20.1 billion are equal. They're not. As a matter of fact, it's not only not parity between the two systems, it's the biggest disparity we've ever seen between the two systems. Well, why does that matter? It's not just because we're asking for more money for the DOT statewide network of roads and bridges just for the sake of it. It's because the need is there. In fact, the last time we saw a public needs assessment from the New York State Department of Transportation was 2009. And in 2009, that number was $25.8 billion over the 5 years that would have followed. They've gotten nowhere near $25.8 billion to invest in their system. And I don't think you need to be an engineer to understand that. You just need to drive around the state on roads and bridges where you're dodging potholes or looking at bridges and kind of crossing your finger maybe as you go over. Now the governor gets a lot of credit for advancing the reconstruction of the Tappan Zee Bridge, and it's a good thing. And a big part of the narrative of why that was so important was the terrible condition of the Tappan Zee Bridge. There were literally spots on that bridge where if you were going slowly enough, you could look down and see the river through the deck of that bridge. It was terrible. But what you might not know is that there's 588 bridges across New York State that are in as bad or worse condition as the Tappan Zee Bridge. And they're in many of our communities. And they might not be as big or famous as the Tappan Zee Bridge, but they're just as important to our communities, to the families and the businesses that rely on them to get from A to B. And they should be able to do it safely and reliably. And again, the folks in this community know all too well what happens when you've not taken care of your infrastructure and things fail. It is a big problem for our families, it's a big problem for our communities, and a big problem for our economy. That's why we're making this case. That's why this is the year that we need to restore parity between the MTA and the DOT. It's the right thing for the whole state to invest equitably and reasonably in both systems, and we hope that that's going to be the end result of the budget process this year. So we're glad to have so many friends and leaders with us.